I always thought I knew Clara. We'd been married for over a decade, and in that time, you think you can tell when something's off. But I didn't see it coming. Not at first. It started with small things. Clara coming home later than usual. She worked at the gallery, had meetings with clients, but this felt different. She'd be distracted, distant. She wasn't present in the way she used to be. Her phone was always face down, or she'd step out of the room when a text came in. I tried to push it out of my mind, but over time, I couldn't ignore it. Something was off. I don't know why I didn't confront her sooner. Maybe I wasn't ready to admit what I was starting to feel. But one night, everything changed. I was sitting at my desk, sorting through some old photos. Out of nowhere, Clara's email pinged. The subject line caught my attention. Graham, and my stomach sank. Graham. Her co-worker. He had always been around, nothing special. But when I opened the email, I saw a string of messages between them. And they were anything but professional. The messages weren't about work. They were intimate, personal. They talked about missing each other, about late-night meetings, about how good it felt to be together. My chest tightened. I couldn't believe it, but I couldn't look away either. This wasn't some harmless friendship. It was an affair. I didn't know how long it had been going on, but that didn't matter anymore. Clara had been seeing Graham behind my back, and I hadn't even noticed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She came home late that night, like always, but something was different. She looked at me, but there was a coldness in her eyes, a detachment that hadn't been there before. I didn't know how to start the conversation, so I just said it. Clara, what's going on with you and Graham? Her face went pale. She instantly tried to cover it up, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. It's nothing, Marcus, she said quickly, avoiding my gaze. He's just a friend. You're overreacting. I shook my head. Clara, don't lie to me. I've seen the messages. She froze, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she mumbled, a few months. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. The word stung like a slap. A few months? All this time, and she thought it was just a mistake? My trust had been shattered in an instant. A mistake? You've been sleeping with him behind my back, and you call it a mistake? I asked, my voice shaking, but not with anger, just disbelief. Her eyes welled up with tears, but I couldn't feel sorry for her. She tried to explain, tried to apologize, but the words didn't matter anymore. She'd already made her choice, and it wasn't me. I stood there, silent, letting the weight of the situation settle in. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The betrayal was enough. The next few hours were a blur. Clara kept apologizing, trying to explain herself, but it was too late. I couldn't look at her the same way. She'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. As I lay in bed that night, I felt this coldness inside of me. I'd been blindsided by someone I thought I knew, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't just going to walk away quietly. I wasn't the kind of man who let things slide. I wasn't going to sit around and let her pretend like nothing happened. I had a plan. A slow burn of revenge. And I'd make sure both Clara and Graham paid for this betrayal. They'd regret it. I was done being the fool. After that night, I couldn't look at Clara the same way. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, just sorry she got caught. I wasn't going to accept her lies. I wasn't the kind of guy to just walk away. I had to make them both feel what I felt. But I wasn't going to act recklessly. I had to be smart about it. Graham was my first target. He had a spotless reputation in the climate change field. Books, speaking engagements, grants. He was a hero to many, but I knew better. Clara had mentioned more than once how some of his research didn't add up, and how he had joked about fudging data when under pressure. That was my opening. I dug into Graham's past, and it wasn't hard to find the cracks. His research was full of questionable data, cherry-picked conclusions, and misused grants. It didn't take long to connect the dots. I gathered everything, emails, reports, and documents, and leaked them to a few journalists I trusted. Within days, Graham was exposed. His books were pulled, his speaking events cancelled, and his funding revoked. His career was ruined, and I felt a dark satisfaction. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice. But I wasn't done with Clara. I needed something that would haunt her long after the dust settled. Confronting her again would be too easy. I needed to immortalize her betrayal. I'd always been into photography, and I knew how to tell a story through my art. So I wrote a book, a fictionalized memoir titled The Huntress Folly, a story about a woman betraying her husband with a man from her work. The details were too specific to ignore. I didn't name Clara, but she'd recognize herself. The book became a bestseller, and rumors swirled about its inspiration. I sent Clara a signed copy, marking certain passages about the pain of betrayal. She'd know it was her. I wasn't done. I sent her a framed photograph of a dying tree with the caption, "For things once vibrant, now withered by selfish shadows." Graham was finished, and Clara would never escape the shame of what she'd done. Me? I was just getting started. Clara wasn't the same after receiving the book and the photograph. I saw the way she tried to hide her discomfort when she looked at me, like she wasn't sure whether to feel embarrassed or ashamed. It didn't matter. I could see right through her. She was too proud to admit how much the book had stung. She didn't bring it up again, but I knew it was eating at her. Every time she turned a page, every time she saw the framed photo on the wall, she'd be reminded of what she did. And that was the point. But as much as I wanted to keep turning the screw, I knew I had to give her one last chance to face the music, even if it was just for my own satisfaction. So, I waited. I let her stew in her own guilt. I watched her unravel in the quietest ways. She started staying out more, pretending like she was still working late at the gallery, but I knew better. Then, one day, after what felt like forever, she reached out. Clara called me at the office, her voice trembling. "Marcus, we need to talk." It wasn't like her to sound so vulnerable. The woman who'd stood in front of me with nothing but excuses now sounded broken. "I'm listening," I said, keeping my tone cool. I've been thinking about everything," she said. "About us. And what happened with Graham." She paused, probably trying to find the right words. "I'm sorry. I know it's too late, but I need you to understand. I was lost. I wasn't myself. I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear her explanation. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of thinking I'd forgive her. But I listened. She rambled on about how Graham had been a comfort when things were tough, how she wasn't happy with our relationship, how she'd made a mistake. She cried. I just let her talk, keeping my silence like a wall. When she finished, I finally spoke. "Clara, you can't take back what you did. I've moved on. You should too." "I can't move on without you," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. I felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow. Just emptiness. "You had me once, and you left. I'm not the same man anymore. I've found my peace." She didn't say anything after that. We both hung up, and I knew that was it. She had no more power over me. Over the next few months, things changed for me. I kept my distance from Clara, who tried to reach out once in a while, but I was done. I started taking the photography expeditions I'd been dreaming about for years. Africa. The savannas. The wild animals. I was building a life without her. I felt free, untethered from the past. The more I immersed myself in nature, the more I realized how small and insignificant my old life with Clara seemed. But then, one day, while I was in Africa, I got a letter. It was from Clara, asking to meet. She had flown to Africa, hoping to see me one last time, to talk things through. When I returned to my hut, I found a note pinned to the door. "You had me once, and you left. The wilderness has claimed me now." I didn't need to say anything more. Clara had tried, but she had no place in my life anymore. My revenge was complete. It was surreal, seeing that note pinned to my door. The wilderness has claimed me now. It wasn't just some cliché phrase. It felt real, like I was finally free. There was no going back to the life I had left behind, no turning back to the hollow version of myself that had allowed Clara's betrayal to fester for so long. I had shed that skin. Clara thought she could win me back. She thought a last-ditch plea would fix everything. But there was no fixing it. Not for her. Not for me. She was still chasing ghosts, still clinging to the pieces of a life we'd both long since outgrown. And I was done playing that part. Done with the lies. Done with the manipulation. I had found something real now, something bigger than both of us, something that couldn't be tainted by human greed or deceit. Africa was exactly what I needed. The wide open landscapes, the raw beauty of nature, everything felt purer here. The animals, the land, the silence. It was where I was meant to be. I was no longer the man who'd been betrayed, the fool who thought love was enough to hold everything together. I had become something else, something stronger. I poured myself into my work. Wildlife photography became my passion, my escape. Every moment in the field was a reminder of the freedom I'd earned. I led expeditions, captured images that told stories of survival, beauty, and brutality. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing that every picture I took was a piece of me, authentic, untainted. Every shot was mine, and no one could take it from me. Clara's messages continued for a while. She'd send texts, emails, none of them asking for forgiveness, but all of them trying to make sense of her actions. She wanted closure. She wanted me to be the man she could apologize to, so she could feel better about what she'd done. But I wasn't interested in closure. I had found my peace, and I wasn't about to let her drag me back into the mess I'd left behind. Then came the phone call. It was from her, again. She was in Africa, a few hours from where I was, and wanted to meet. I didn't know what she hoped for. Some grand apology, maybe? Or for me to open up and give her another chance. I didn't take the call. A part of me wondered if she thought she could fix things by showing up, but it wasn't just her that had changed, it was me. I had moved on. I had lived without her, found my strength, my purpose. She was still stuck in the past, but I wasn't. That night, I sat alone in my hut, the stars above as the only company. There was no bitterness in me, no anger, just peace. I was finally free from the chains of the past. When I came back to the city a few months later, I found Clara's letters waiting for me, ones begging for a chance, for us to start over. I read them, and I thought about how far I had come. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The game had ended, and I was the one who walked away a winner. I had rebuilt my life from the ashes of betrayal, and I was never looking back. Clara and Graham had their consequences. But me? I had my freedom, and it felt like the ultimate victory. Even after everything, Clara and Graham's lives didn't stop spinning. The fallout from the scandal was brutal. Graham's career was wrecked, books pulled, speaking gigs cancelled, funding revoked. And Clara? She was a wreck, too. But I didn't let myself get caught up in their mess. I had moved on, and Africa was where I found my peace. The vast landscapes, the raw beauty of nature, it felt purer than anything I'd known. I wasn't angry anymore. I had found my freedom. Still, their shadows lingered. Mutual friends started reaching out, concerned about how I was handling the fallout. Some were on my side, some on hers, but I didn't care. I was done with all of it. I wasn't looking for closure or sympathy. I was looking for a life that wasn't tainted by their betrayal. Then came the emails from Graham. The first one was full of apologies. How sorry he was, how he didn't mean for things to go so far with Clara. He even claimed he regretted everything. It felt empty, though. It wasn't for me he was sorry. It was for himself. I didn't respond. The second email was more desperate. He begged for a chance to meet, to talk. He even mentioned how Clara was a mess without me, how she needed me. I deleted it without a second thought. I wasn't interested in fixing anything. That version of my life was over, and I wasn't going back. Months later, I returned to the city for my first big photography exhibition. It was a huge milestone for me, and the night felt like a fresh start. As I walked through the gallery, greeting people, I spotted Clara standing across the room, looking at one of my photos. She hadn't seen me yet, but I could tell she was uncomfortable, like she didn't belong there. She was trying to smile, but her face looked tired. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. She wasn't my problem anymore. I was fine without her. Eventually, she saw me. Her face changed, That moment of recognition. "I see you've been busy," she said, her voice shaky. "Your work's incredible, Marcus." "Thanks," I said, keeping it short. "It's been good to get away from everything." Clara hesitated, then said, "I didn't know you'd be here." I wanted to talk, to explain. I looked at her, feeling nothing but indifference. I had no interest in revisiting the past. "There's nothing left to explain, Clara. We had our time. It's over." She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. I could see the desperation in her eyes, but I didn't care anymore. I had moved on. "Goodbye, Clara," I said, turning to walk away. She didn't try to stop me. And as I walked out of that gallery, I realized how much I had changed. I wasn't the same man who had been broken by her betrayal. I was free. Completely free. And I knew, deep down, that I'd won, not just in their downfall, but in my own ability to rebuild and move forward. The months that followed felt like a blur. Clara's attempts to reach out tapered off, and I could tell she had finally gotten the message. The woman I had once loved, the one who had betrayed me, was a ghost of the past. But I didn't feel the need to destroy her anymore. I didn't need to see her suffer. That wasn't what mattered now. What mattered was what I had built for myself. Something far bigger than what she and Graham had taken from me. Africa had changed me. I'd spent months photographing wildlife, immersing myself in the raw beauty of nature. It wasn't just the animals. It was the freedom, the quiet strength of the wilderness. I was far from the man I'd been when I was tangled up in the lies and deceit of my marriage. I was at peace. More at peace than I'd ever been. The work was satisfying, more than I could have imagined. Every day I spent out in the field, I felt like I was capturing a part of my own soul, the part that had been hidden for so long. I led expeditions through some of the wildest parts of Africa, photographing everything from elephants to lions, but it wasn't just about the animals. It was about the way nature could heal a person. It was about finding my purpose in a place where the only thing that mattered was survival, beauty, and the moment. And then, one day, I got the call. It was from an old friend. Someone I hadn't talked to since before the divorce. "Marcus," he said, his voice tense. "Clara's in trouble." I was quiet for a moment. Part of me wanted to say I didn't care, but another part, the part one didn't recognize anymore, was curious. "What kind of trouble?" "She's been in and out of the hospital. Looks like she's dealing with depression. She's been asking about you. Says she wants to talk." I was silent. I thought about it for a second, but the truth was clear. There was nothing left to say. I had no obligation to her. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. I didn't owe her my attention or my forgiveness. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But I'm not coming back for her. Not for any of it." There was a pause on the other end. "I understand, man. Just thought you should know." I hung up, but I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I might. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel anything, really. I had moved on. I had rebuilt my life without her, without any of the toxic ties that once held me down. And yet, there was this small, hollow space in my chest. A space I had filled with nature, with photography, with my own self-respect. Still, I knew I had done what I set out to do. I'd let go of the past, let go of Clara's betrayal, and in doing so, I had won. I wasn't bitter anymore. I wasn't angry. I was free. I threw myself back into my work, focusing on the next exhibition, the next adventure. And somewhere along the way, I realized that the revenge I had sought had never been about punishing Clara or Graham. It had been about reclaiming my own life. The real victory was in the freedom I had earned. The world I had rebuilt for myself was far removed from the chaos of my past. Africa, with its vast horizons and untamed beauty, had become my sanctuary. But even in this new chapter, the past found a way to creep in, even if it wasn't in the form of Clara or Graham anymore. It came in the form of quiet moments of reflection, the kind you don't expect when you're too busy moving forward. I was leading another expedition, this one deep into the savannah. The days were long, the work demanding, but I thrived in the stillness. Each time I'd see an animal in its natural element, whether it was a cheetah hunting or a lion resting under a tree, it felt like I was witnessing something sacred, something untouched. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was becoming the man I was always supposed to be. But in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the day's work was done, I'd find myself thinking about Clara. It was a brief, fleeting thought. Nothing more than a shadow, a memory of a life that once was. There were no feelings of longing or regret, just the recognition of how much I had changed since that time. I had been angry for so long. Angry at her betrayal. Angry at Graham for playing his part. But over time, the anger faded. It wasn't that I'd forgiven them, it was that I didn't need to hold on to it anymore. I had built something of my own, something that didn't need their approval or acknowledgement. I had found something worth more than revenge. Peace. Then, something unexpected happened. One evening, as I was finishing up some editing on my latest batch of photographs, I received an email. It was from a journalist who had been covering Graham's downfall. He wanted to know if I had any comment on the situation, whether I had been involved in the scandal or knew more about it. He was asking for a statement. A follow-up, he said, to the media storm I had started months ago. I stared at the screen for a moment. The question felt so far removed from the life I was living now. Did I even care about the aftermath anymore? It was all over. Graham was a pariah, his career in ruins. Clara was no longer a part of my world. They had both been exposed for what they were, and I had walked away from the wreckage, stronger and free. But I felt a sense of finality in that email. This was the last piece of the past, lingering in my inbox, asking for my words. Part of me was tempted to respond, to add one final nail to their coffins. But then I thought about it. What was the point? I didn't need to make them suffer anymore. They had already done that to themselves. So, I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the email and went back to my work. I didn't need the last word. I had taken my revenge in the only way that mattered, by moving on and making a life of my own. The past was over. And the person I was now didn't have to prove anything to anyone, least of all to people who had no place in my world anymore. In that moment, I realized that true freedom didn't come from punishing others. It came from letting go. Letting go of the past. Letting go of anger. Letting go of guilt. And most of all, letting go of the idea that I needed to keep score. I was free. And nothing, no one, could take that from me. Years passed, and my life continued on its new path. The anger, the bitterness, all of it faded. Africa had given me more than just a fresh start. It gave me purpose. I led expeditions, captured photos that made a real impact on wildlife conservation, and spoke at international events. I had found my place in the world, far away from the wreckage of my past. Still, I couldn't escape hearing about Clara and Graham now and then. Clara had faded from the public eye, her reputation damaged beyond repair. Graham's career, once built on false credentials, had crashed and burned. But none of it mattered to me anymore. They were their own problems, and I was done being part of their story. One afternoon, while out in the field, I received a call on my satellite phone. It was a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment, I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. Marcus. I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Clara. Clara. I said, my voice guarded. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, she began, her voice trembling, but I need to talk to you. I'm sorry for everything. For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Her apology seemed so distant, so foreign now. But I stayed on the line, hearing the weight of her regret. She spoke about how she had ruined her life, how she had lost herself, how the affair had destroyed everything. She admitted that she had been in therapy, trying to make sense of the mistakes she had made. I don't expect your forgiveness, she said. I just needed you to know. I understand now. I wish I could take it all back. I took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. The anger I had once held for her was gone, but I wasn't the same person I had been when she left me. I didn't need her apology. I had moved on. I've forgiven you a long time ago, Clara, I said softly. I don't carry that with me anymore. I've moved on, and I hope you can do the same. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her letting go of some of her own guilt. Thank you, she whispered. I just wanted you to know that. I ended the call shortly after, not feeling anger or relief, just a sense of finality. That was the closure I had needed. The past had been buried long ago, and I had no reason to go back. I had already let go of the bitterness, the hurt. I had built a new life. I looked out across the savannah, the sun dipping behind the horizon. For the first time in a long while, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. My story with Clara was truly over. And in that peace, I realized that the only forgiveness I'd ever needed was for myself. I turned away from the phone, walked back toward camp, and let the winds of the wild carry me forward. My life was mine again, and no one could take that from me. The years went by in a blur. Time, I realized, had a way of dulling the edges of pain and regret. What once felt like a wound that would never heal became a scar, one that didn't hurt anymore, but still carried a story. Africa had become my home in a way that I never expected. The land, the animals, the quiet nights under endless stars, it all gave me a sense of peace I never thought I'd find again. I threw myself deeper into my work. My photography was getting more recognition, and I was finally living the life I dreamed of. I felt connected to something bigger, something wild and untamed. Every expedition, every shot I took, felt like a part of my soul was being captured in the frame. It wasn't just about wildlife or landscapes, it was about me, finding the strength to move on, to exist without the chains of my past. I had made a life for myself that I was proud of. The echoes of Clara's betrayal, the aftermath of Graham's ruin, it all seemed so distant now. They weren't part of my world anymore. My world was Africa, the work I was doing, the people I was meeting. I wasn't interested in anything from the old life, not the lies or the false promises. Then, one day, I got a call. It was a familiar number. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. Another reminder of a life I had left behind. It was Graham. I hesitated. I hadn't heard from him in years, not since everything came crashing down. And the thought of hearing from him now, after everything, felt strange. But I picked up anyway. "Marcus," he asked, his voice sounding hollow. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I needed to reach out." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to hang up, but another part of me was curious. What could he possibly want now? I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything," he continued. "For what I did. For the way things went down with Clara. I've lost everything, Marcus. I've lost my career, my credibility, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I regret it all." His words hung in the air, heavy and empty. I could tell he was genuinely remorseful, but it didn't change anything. He had made his choices, just like Clara had. They had both betrayed me, and no amount of regret or apology would fix that. "I appreciate you reaching out," I said, my voice steady. "But it's over, Graham. What happened, what you did, it's done. I've moved on, and I'm not looking back. I hope you can find your way, but that's not my responsibility anymore." There was a long pause. I could almost hear the weight of his regret in that silence. "I understand," he finally said. "I just wanted you to know." The call ended, and I sat there for a moment, looking out over the savannah. I had already let go of my anger and resentment, but hearing Graham's apology still felt like closure. The past was truly behind me. I had nothing left to prove to anyone, not to Clara, not to Graham, and certainly not to myself. I had built something better, something real, and that was all I needed. I grabbed my camera, walked out into the wilderness, and let the world continue to turn without me. The life I had now was full, rich, and free, and that was more than enough. The years had softened the edges of my past, and with time, the anger that once burned hot began to fade into something unrecognizable. Africa had become my home, not just an escape, but a place where I rediscovered who I was. I still thought about Clara now and then, but it was more like remembering an old chapter in a book I'd long since closed. She had tried to reach out, but I'd already moved on. I didn't need her apologies, didn't need any closure she might offer. I had found peace on my own. Then, one day, out of the blue, I received a letter. It was handwritten, old-fashioned, almost out of place in my world now. It was from Clara. I stared at the envelope for a moment. Part of me didn't want to open it. I had let go of everything connected to her, but I couldn't ignore it. I carefully broke the seal and began to read. Marcus, it began. I don't expect you to read this. I know I've lost the right to your time. But I'm writing anyway. I need to tell you something. As I read her words, I was struck by how much had changed. She spoke of her regrets, of how she had spent years regretting what she had done to me. She wrote about how the affair with Graham had ultimately destroyed her own life, and how she had come to understand the depth of the pain she had caused. I've hated myself for what I did to you, she confessed, and I know I can't undo it. But I hope one day you can think of me and know that I understand. I paused for a moment, the letter still in my hands. Part of me wanted to be angry, to feel the sting of her betrayal again, but I didn't. What she had done, what she was now apologizing for, it didn't affect me anymore. I had already let go of that pain long ago. I had healed on my own, and her apology, though heartfelt, couldn't change anything now. I folded the letter slowly, tucking it into my bag without any dramatic emotion. No anger, no relief. Just a quiet understanding that this was the final piece of the past that needed to be let go. The next morning, I took a walk across the savannah, letting the quiet beauty of the land settle over me. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the wild grasses, and I felt a deep, unshakable peace. The past was gone. The mistakes, the betrayal, the hurt. It was all behind me. I wrote Clara a short message. Thank you for your letter. I've moved on, and I wish you the best. It was simple, direct, and final. No more words were needed. The closure I had long searched for had already been found, not in her apology, but in the life I had built for myself. As I stood there, camera in hand, looking at the vast, open landscape before me, I realized something. I had won. Not in some dramatic, revenge-driven way, but in the quiet, steady way that mattered most. In the way that only I could. I had built a life of purpose and peace, and that was all that mattered. The past was over, and I was finally free. Life in Africa had settled into a peaceful rhythm. My days were filled with work, photography, leading expeditions, and the quiet joy of being deeply connected to the wild. I had finally found a place where the past couldn't reach me. The betrayal, the pain, the anger, they were all distant memories, things I had let go of long ago. I had moved on, or so I thought. Then, one day, a letter arrived. Not from Clara, not from anyone I expected. It was from a journalist, someone I hadn't heard from in years. They were revisiting the scandal that had unraveled Graham's career, and they wanted to do a retrospective piece. They needed to know more about the whistleblower, who had exposed Graham's fraud and caused his downfall. The journalist wanted my side of the story. For a moment, I felt a strange pull. I had buried that chapter of my life, and here it was, knocking again. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward without looking back. But the other part, the part that had set all of this in motion, felt a strange curiosity. I'd never intended for any of this to become public, but now that it was, I felt detached from it all. I wasn't the same man who had been consumed by rage and hurt. I agreed to the interview. A few weeks later, the journalist arrived in Africa. We met at a quiet cafe not far from my base camp, and we talked for hours. The conversation covered everything: Graham's fall from grace, my decision to leak the documents, the media storm that followed. I answered everything as honestly as I could, but the focus had shifted. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about the ripple effects of what had happened and where it had all led me. When the story was published, I felt little. It wasn't sensational, just a well-researched article reflecting on the downfall of a man who had been celebrated for his work, and the anonymous whistleblower who had made it all unravel. The past had been acknowledged, but it wasn't the focus. The story was simply a moment in time that had already passed. The article didn't make waves. It wasn't a grand finale or a dramatic revelation. It was just a chapter of my life that was now in the rearview mirror. And that, in a strange way, was the final piece of closure I hadn't realized I needed. That evening, I sat alone by the campfire, the article in my hands. The past wasn't something I needed to revisit anymore. I had moved on long ago, and I had built something real, something meaningful here. I was no longer tied to the past, not to Clara, not to Graham, not to anyone. The fire crackled as the sun set behind the mountains. For the first time, I truly felt the weight of the last few years fall away. The past was over. The chapter was closed. Tomorrow, I would go back to work, back to the wilderness I had come to love. But tonight, I felt peace. A peace that came from knowing that I had let go of everything. My life was mine again, and the only direction I needed to go was forward. Months had passed, and life in Africa had become a routine I cherished. My work was fulfilling, and the weight of my past seemed lighter with each passing day. The betrayal, the hurt, it all felt so distant. I had created a new life for myself, one that was mine and mine alone. But then, one morning, everything shifted. I was out in the field, preparing for an expedition, when I received a message that stopped me cold. It was from a local guide I had worked with before. The message was simple. Clara is here. She's asking for you. At first, I couldn't process it. Clara? Here? How had she found me? I had made sure to leave everything behind. No contact, no forwarding addresses. The idea of her showing up, of all places, in this part of the world, felt surreal. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen it. But something inside me stirred. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe the need for closure. After everything, I needed to see for myself. I arranged to meet her in a small town far from my base camp. It was a place I rarely visited, but when I arrived, there she was, standing outside a cafe. She looked different, older, weary, but still unmistakably Clara. She stood up as I approached, hesitating for a moment, unsure of my reaction. Marcus, she said, her voice tentative. I didn't know where else to go. I've tried everything to find you. I didn't speak at first. I just studied her, feeling a strange mixture of indifference and something else. Maybe pity. She wasn't the confident woman I once knew. There was a vulnerability to her now that made her seem smaller, less powerful. I'm sorry, she continued, her voice cracking. I've made so many mistakes. I thought I could fix things with Graham, but it's all fallen apart. I've lost everything. I just want to make things right. Can we talk? I took a breath, watching her. I had let go of everything. I didn't need closure or an apology. I had already healed. I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Clara, I said finally. I've moved on. I've let go of everything we had. I'm fine. Her face tightened, but I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She wasn't here to manipulate me anymore. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. This was her reckoning. I understand, she whispered, her eyes downcast. I just needed to hear you say it. I needed to know you're okay. The words stung more than I expected. I didn't want to prolong this, but I knew it was time to give her what she needed. I'm okay, I said quietly. And I'm better for it. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't speak. I could see the weight she carried, but I knew there was nothing more for me to offer. I turned to leave, feeling a strange sense of closure. Goodbye, Clara, I said. Take care of yourself. I walked away, not looking back. The past was finally behind me. I had no more anger, no more bitterness. I was free. As I made my way back to the wilderness, I felt a weight lift off me. Clara's presence had reminded me of how far I had come, how much I had healed. The memories of her and the pain we shared seemed even more distant now. And for the first time in years, I felt completely free. Life in Africa had settled back into its steady rhythm after Clara's visit. The landscape, untouched and unchanging, felt like the perfect balm for the wounds I had carried for so long. I was fully immersed in my work, leading expeditions, capturing stunning wildlife photographs, and living a life I had finally come to love. I had no reason to look back. But then, the past found me again. I had just returned from a day in the bush when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered it out of habit. Marcus. The voice on the other end made my stomach tighten. It was Graham. My mind raced. What could he possibly want after everything that had happened? His career had collapsed. He had been exposed for the fraud he was. He'd lost everything, his reputation, his livelihood, his friends. Marcus, I know it's been a long time, Graham said, but I need to talk to you. Please. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately. But I didn't. Instead, I gave him the bare minimum. You've got 5 minutes. I don't want to make excuses, he said, his voice shaky. But I'm sorry. For everything. I never should have done that to you. I was selfish, and I ruined everything. I know that now. I've lost everything. I just need to know. Can you forgive me? Can we move on? I stayed silent, letting his words sink in. I had already moved on. I had forgiven him long ago, not for his sake, but for mine. I'm fine, Graham, I said. I've let go of it. I'm better than fine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the weight lifting off him. I needed to hear that, Graham said, his voice quiet. I just needed to know that you're okay. I am, I replied. Goodbye, Graham. I hung up, feeling oddly drained. I had no need for further closure. The past was gone, and I had moved forward. Later, while photographing a lioness in the wild, I thought about my journey. I had let go of everything. I was no longer defined by betrayal or revenge. I had found my peace. And nothing, not even Graham's call, could change that. The days in Africa blended together like the colors of a sunset. Quiet, but always shifting, always beautiful. I had found a place in the world where my past no longer had the power to reach me. Still, something about the isolation, the endless open skies, the faraway horizons, made me realize that I wasn't entirely free. There was one last piece of unfinished business. It came in the form of a message one evening. I'm coming. We need to talk. Clara. Her name hit me like a jolt, knocking me back into the past, where I had spent so much energy trying to escape. After everything, after all the lies, the betrayal, the years spent unraveling my life from hers, she wanted to talk? I didn't know whether to feel anger or amusement. But in the end, I did what I had to do. I agreed to meet her. I chose a small village in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place that made it clear I wasn't running back into the arms of my old life. It was only when I arrived that I saw her, standing beneath a tree, looking like she had aged years in the short time since I last saw her. She wasn't the woman who had destroyed my world. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had been worn down by her own choices. She didn't approach right away. She waited for me, as if she was testing to see whether the distance between us was real or just an illusion. Marcus, she said softly when I came into earshot. I didn't know what I expected, but I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't speak. I let her continue. I've been thinking, she said, about everything, about what I did. I thought I could fix things with Graham. I was wrong. I've lost everything. My reputation. My self-respect. Everything that mattered. I still didn't respond. Part of me wanted to walk away, to turn my back on her completely. But another part of me, the part I'd buried long ago, waited for something. Some form of closure, some acknowledgement that the man I had been had died with our marriage. I'm sorry, Marcus, she said, her voice breaking. I wanted you to know that. I stared at her for a long time, the silence between us more powerful than any words could have been. Clara, I said finally, I've already let it go. I'm not holding on to anything. There's nothing left between us. She looked down, the weight of my words settling on her. And in that moment, I realized, this wasn't about forgiveness or closure. It was about her facing the consequences of her actions. And she had to do that alone. Without another word, I turned and walked away. This time, I didn't feel the need to look back. The wilderness was waiting for me, as it always had. But for the first time, it felt like something more than just a place to escape. It was where I had become myself again. No more ties. No more echoes of the past. Just the sound of my own breath in the still air, the ground beneath my feet, and the knowledge that I no longer had to run. Months passed, and life in Africa felt like a steady, peaceful rhythm. The past, with all its pain, had faded into the background. The wilderness had given me more than just a fresh start. It had become a sanctuary. The wide open spaces, the raw beauty of the land. It all reminded me of how far I had come from the life I once knew. But just as I had begun to think I was beyond it all, the past had a way of finding me. I was on an expedition, deep in the savannah, when my phone rang. I stepped away from camp to take the call, half expecting some news about the animals we'd been tracking. But when I saw the number, I froze. It was Clara. I wasn't sure why she was calling. I had let her go long ago, but something told me this wouldn't be a simple conversation. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know who else to turn to." I didn't speak right away. Part of me wanted to hang up, but another part of me knew I needed to hear her out. "I know I've messed up," she continued. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I need your help. I don't know what to do anymore." I could hear the desperation in her voice. But it wasn't enough to pull me back into her world. I had spent too long unraveling everything that had bound me to her. I had to stay strong. "Clara," I said quietly, "I'm not the person you need. I've moved on. You need to do the same." There was a long pause. I could almost hear her processing my words, but I didn't offer more. This wasn't about me rescuing her anymore. "I know," she whispered. "I think I always knew." I didn't respond. She had said what she needed to say, but there was nothing left for us. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she added, but the words didn't mean anything anymore. I had nothing left to give. "Goodbye, Clara," I said, before hanging up. I stood there for a moment, the wind in my face. The past had tried to drag me back in, but I wasn't going to let it. I had found my place in this world, and I wasn't going to lose it. As I returned to camp, I knew it was finally over. The horizon was wide open, and there was nothing behind me anymore.